Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Louis Falgout.
And I am your other host, Stephen Falgout. Get Recc'd is our bi-weekly podcast where
Host.
Louis and I will recommend something to each other, and then the following week talk about it. Today we'll be talking about two films. We had a themed rec last week. We will be discussing a Does It Hold Up style of rec. Basically, last week I recommended something to Louis that I have seen quite a number of times, and Louis has also seen, and he has done the same for me. And we'll be kind of discussing what our thoughts on it now, going back. I think we're going to start with, Louis, what you recommended to me, so if you want to kind of talk about that.
Yeah, we'll go for it. This is going to be a rapid-fire episode, by the way, so get ready, everybody. Strap in. Okay, so Birdman.
No 2 minutes at the beginning
no 2
this
minutes
time.
At the beginning. Fuck you. You don't get the amazing comedy. Birdman was a film that came out in 2014. I know Steven and I saw it when it came out. We saw it without any prior knowledge of really what it was, beyond the fact that it had a high score on Rotten Tomatoes or something. I had no idea what it was. We watched it, came out of it, and it blew my mind. And I've watched it so much. It's one of my favorite movies, and I wanted to see how it held up for Steven on a reviewing. So, Steven, why don't you go ahead and tell us that? And the timer, 15 minutes, everybody. Rapid-fire bonus episode. Also, tell us how our mix is. Okay, Steven, go ahead.
Yeah, I really remembered enjoying it the first time that we saw it. I remember we saw it with our mother and father, and our mother was not the biggest fan. It is very art house. I think going back to it, I forgot. I still kind of remembered the majority of like what the film was about and the style, but I actually had kind of forgotten about the single track. Everything is, well, I should say I had forgotten more about, because I remembered that most of it's to a drum riff. There's kind of a progressive drum beat that happens throughout the entire course of the film. I like that they kind of intersperse actually people playing drums every now and then in kind of fun ways. But what I had forgotten is that there's more than just drums. There were a couple tracks. Now, there was nothing like gigantic or major, but there were a couple tracks throughout the course of the film that had violin and percussion.
Yeah, it's like a normal cinematic score.
Like kind of a normal cinematic score, and I had kind of forgotten about that. Now they use it in very interesting ways. I think the time when they use it is kind of when he's thinking back. So I'll give just a quick synopsis of the film. Basically, it follows Michael Keaton, although he's not actually Michael Keaton in the movie, but essentially he's Michael Keaton. It follows Michael Keaton as he's trying to create an edition of a Ray Carver novel to stage, because he's trying to come back into the limelight after having played a famous superhero for a very long time in film and then kind of fading into obscurity. So this is his like recall back into the limelight. He has powers, ? That are kind of happening through the film. It's all one continuous shot, or at least it alludes to be one continuous shot. And as I mentioned, it's kind of a drum riff beat that goes out throughout the course of the film. His Birdman, which is the name of the superhero that he played, persona often talks to him in his head or shows up as a physical manifestation of his thoughts. And in those segments, that's where I actually found that they were using those more cinematic score, which I liked a lot because that makes a lot of sense, because it's kind of recalling back to his time of being a big time film actor with large scores.
Yup. Yeah. So when you mentioned about the one-track shot, of course, it isn't actually, like, there are multiple points in this movie where I think it's actually really obvious that there's a cut. Like, it's not, like, badly edited or anything, but it's, like, the screen will go black because somebody goes through a door, and then you can tell the shot's different in the next one. I especially noticed that on reviewings. But, like, whatever the case, just the framework of this makes a ton of sense because it plays like you're watching it on the stage. There are no cuts on the stage. So it's just like watching an actual stage play. Meanwhile, the entire film obviously revolves around that stage play. And one of the things that I want to call out specifically, and yes, I agree that, the score, first of all, is just incredible. Relying on jazz drumming for the majority of the film makes it so intense and quirky when it needs to be, silly when it needs to be. But yeah, especially in the certain scenes where it has to be intense, it is. But and that's something that I wanted to mention too, is I think dialogue wise, this film is actually very intense. I think at certain scenes, and not like in a thriller kind of way or a horror kind of way, or like anything even close to that. I mean, the film is on the surface level a comedy, although I wouldn't say it's particularly hilarious. It plays much more like a drama film in a certain way, and I think that like. Just like the tension between the characters in this film, also the way that it interlocks with the actual writing in the play that they're putting on. There are a lot of callbacks, like certain lines in the play then come back in some real way, like early in the film. I'm going to put up spoilers now, just because I don't know how much we're going to talk spoilers. Early in the film, they talk about how somebody in the play failed to kill himself by shooting himself in the head, and in the end of the film, that's exactly what happens when Michael Keaton, Regan Thompson here, fails to kill himself in front of the live audience. So stuff like that, but like it's just this the writing here, the writing here is just incredible. Like dialogue between character to character in every single scene flows incredibly well, and yeah, like I said, there's just some really intense and emotional scenes. I particularly want to mention my favorite, possibly my favorite scene in the film anyway, is when Regan talks to his daughter in the room and finds her weed, and then the camera lingers on her face as she yells at him and tells him that he's worthless and is meaningless, and lingers on her face as she slowly realizes that she just, or that she just said something really terrible, and it doesn't show his face as the reaction. I really like that.
Yeah, I was just going to call it that scene. There's nothing particularly, or there's, I shouldn't say that. The cinematography, because it is kind of one tracking shot, or alludes to be one tracking shot, is obviously always just kind of front facing, or at least following some character. I actually like the way that they change which character they follow too, so you get basically little perspectives of each of the character as the camera will follow different characters throughout the film. But yeah, I was just going to mention that exact scene when the camera is just lingering on her face, uncomfortably long. Like, you are feeling her emotion as she's also realizing what she's done. And first of all, I will say all the acting performances in this film are also incredible. Emma Stone, Ed Norton, Michael Keaton, they all do an incredible job, every top to bottom. Even Zach Galifianakis' character is wonderful in this.
Yeah, I agree. I also wanted to mention something super clever, and this is another thing about using the format to their advantage in a really crazy and creative way. And again, it's sort of theater-like way. Did you notice how clever and just incredible the time transitions were? As in, like, whenever you would need, because this film doesn't take place over the course of like one day, and yet it's all one shot. So they have to creatively find ways to transition through time. There's one particular scene when Ed Norton's character Mike is about to have sex with Emma Stone's character, and while that's happening, you hear the play being rehearsed underneath the catwalk, but then the camera moves over the catwalk, goes down to the play that's being rehearsed, and it transitions to the actual opening night sequence where Ed Norton is down there. But it does it so seamlessly you don't even realize. There's also shots where the camera pans up to the sky and it quickly goes from night to day. And other things like that, where it's just like you never ever feel like the film is slowing down or even moving through time, even though it is, because these transitions are just so clever and fast and varied too.
Intense is definitely a way I would describe this film. I know you mentioned it before, but it's how I've described this film even within the last couple of days, because it really is very intense. You get very real perspectives of each of these characters and an interesting look into each one of their psyches, and everything has just such a weight to it, and the actors really bring that forward. But also, because of the score and because of the tracking shot, you always just feel this innate tension. And like you mentioned, not like a thriller movie necessarily. I mean, this is a drama film, a black comedy, but they linger on every line in such a way that you really feel that weight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something I wanted to call out. I gotta rack my brain for that because I just lost it. Shit. Yeah. Damn it. Oh, okay.
So good point.
Oh, I'm sorry. I want to talk really about some of the more creative and different scenes in the film, and some of the most impressive. In a way, so there's a sequence in the film where, and again, Stephen mentioned that Regan Thompson, the main lead character here, has powers. Of course, he doesn't really. Nearly every time in the film where he does have powers, there's an explanation as to how it actually happened outside of his head, except for one particular time, which I'll bring up. But or two times in the film actually when that I can bring up. But one of the most amazing scenes, I think, one of the most freeing and beautiful scenes, is when Riggin is about to jump off of a building. Somebody comes and like tries to stop him. He jumps off and he ends up flying around the city. And you watch him fly, and like people are like watching him fly away, like they can actually see it happening. Briefly before this scene, there's also another amazing sequence where like the Birdman character, who previously was just kind of a voice in Riggin's head, actually shows up on screen. And you get this like really silly sequence where like action effects start coming and it's all this bullshit. The Birdman character calls it apocalypse porn. So it's like trying to recreate like an Avengers style thing. In fact, it definitely was trying to do like Avengers because there was like the big mechanical creature, whatever.
And actually they even call out the Avengers in this film.
Yeah.
They talk about Tony Stark or Robert Downey Jr. and his portrayal of Iron Man in the Avengers.
Yeah, and of course, like one of the film's central themes, I think, is sort of it goes back and forth because on one hand, it has this like kind of anti snobbish critic thing that goes on. There's this one critic who is only there intentionally to destroy Riggin's play, and there's some really fantastic dialogue between the actors and this critic. But then also at the same time, the film kind of portrays this like difference between serious art and like superhero and popular art, where we have these scenes where like you see this just silly bullshit, like all the masses just want dumb shit. But of course, I think it's like Riggin is like actually somewhat torn, even though he doesn't really admit it. But in this sequence, you see he feels like almost freed by that, so he is kind of torn between the two ideas. Let's talk about the ending sequence really fast before we have to wrap it up, because it's just amazing.
Super quick, I wanted to mention, so you said that he has quote-unquote powers, and they're always explained. I wanted to take that thought to the end. So you mentioned he jumps off the building, he kind of flies away, and then I think one of the funniest scenes is he then gets out of a cab, like he lands on the ground and walks into the theater, but actually he really was just getting out of a cab, and the cabbie's like running after him like, hey, you didn't pay.
Yeah
And that's pretty good.
Good stuff. Yeah. Final scene though, what about the final scene? That's like the
Yeah, so the final scene. So first of all, I think I'll start with probably the play, right? So
sure.
he talks to his ex-wife about how he tried to commit suicide. It's this very intense, very emotional, very powerful scene about how he's not a good father and he just wanted to be there. Then he ultimately ends up basically trying to commit suicide on stage. Instead of using a prop gun for the last scene of the play, he uses a real gun and shoots himself at the very end of the play. Another incredible scene where they just are, after he shoots himself, they are just lingering on the audience as they're first shocked, then applauding, then continuing to applaud. You watch the critic walk out of the theater. It lasts too long because you know what just happened. You as the viewer of the film know what just happened. It turns out he missed himself. He shot himself in the nose. He missed his head. He shot himself in the nose, and he was still fine. And then at the very end of the film, he ends up jumping out of the window, flying out of the window? Question mark.
So he's like, so he's like in the hospital, and they made him a new nose or whatever. So actually, I love the dialogue of Zach Galifianakis in that scene. Is really funny. And the critic who promised to destroy his play no matter what actually ended up giving it a good review strictly because he actually shot himself on stage. And that's what the unexpected virtue of ignorance thing there is all about. That like there is some kind of newfound art in somebody who didn't understand theater making a play, and I guess but anyway, and that's like the one thing that like I think he always wanted was just this kind of admiration. He just wanted to be admired. There's a quote in the very opening credits, something about what is it that you wanted to feel myself loved and admired on the earth. So of course that's what actually happens. But then so he ends up trying to kill himself again in the hospital room. He jumps out of or he goes up to the window. Camera pans back to the door as his daughter comes in. I love the score here. The drumming here is fantastic. It really builds that tension. She looks out the window. You assume he's dead. She looks down, but she doesn't see anything. And then she looks up in the sky and smiles, and it cuts to credits. So of course the implication is this is again the only other moment in the film where it appears that other people can actually see his powers, which of course comes right after the sequence where he finally got what he wanted, which was just admiration as a serious artist, but of course in a really ironic way. But it is one of the best, I think one of the best, probably the most incredible, possibly the most incredible moment in the entire film is just that ending. It always just, it's a mix of so many emotions that this film leaves me with at the end, and I just think it's really amazing. Yeah, so I guess that's time to wrap it up. So Stephen, what are your final thoughts? And also, you have to answer the question: does it hold up?
Yeah, so that was our rapid fire take on Birdman. I'm gonna start by saying yes, definitely holds up. Absolutely worth a watch. I think it is an incredible film. It was something that came out at a time, and it just still feels so unique, so different. A really interesting take, and especially as like super giant mega blockbuster movies have only gotten to be more common and
worse,
more frequent.
In some
yeah,
ways.
It really feels like it's just a continued interesting representation of art culture. It's hard to not give this movie like just a 10, honestly. Like I love this thing top to bottom. Now it's not something that I would watch all the time, but I'm really glad that I actually went back to it because it had been a while, and it's still absolutely worth a watch. I definitely recommend this one.
Yeah, and I would also give the film a 10. It's amazing. I don't need to answer whether it holds up because the question wasn't for me. I watch this film all the time, and it's in my top 5 favorites. I think it's absolutely incredible, and and also rewarding on rewatches because there's a lot of cool callbacks and things like that throughout the film. I left the spoiler tag up. That was dumb, but we're doing it fucking live. Okay, Steven, now it's time for you to introduce what you recommend. The timer went off. Look at that.
No!
We beat it.
Oh,
all right. What did you recommend to me, Steven? I need to start the timer again.
Okay, so Lewis, I recommended to you the Monty Python film, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. This was a film by the Monty Python Flying Circus crew. It was a parody film. It kind of follows the events of the King Arthur, Holy Grail story, but obviously it's a much more comedic take. And Lewis, I will hand it to you.
Yeah, so I guess the question here of does it hold up has a lot to do with, I'm assuming, what your intention is that the film is very old. It's a comedy that many people say has lived through time, and I guess we're asking that question for ourselves.
And the other thing I would mention is that this movie is just so infinitely quoted,
yes,
and those sorts of things that it was an interesting retrospective to see, like, with all of that, with as popular as it is and as old as it is now and ingrained in pop culture, does it hold up?
I think as a comedy film, this one holds up better than like 90% of comedy films ever released. And what's really amazing about this movie is that I honestly think it's only gotten better with time. This style of comedy is exactly the style of comedy that the internet has founded itself on. Even in some ways to this day, now that we're in the post ironic era, and there's still fundamentals of comedy that this film utilized that are still prevalent on the internet. That you cannot say that for the vast majority of comedy films that are ever released. Only an independently created film like this could have possibly had that chance to do something like this, because yes, it's a story, and the comedy does happen through situations in the story, you could say, in a very traditional comedy film way, but not in the way that other films do, because really the comedy of this film is essentially how bad it is. Like, the movie is terribly, just absolutely, like, in many ways, it's not like poorly shot or necessarily, but like terribly produced. The production quality in this thing is really bad. There's decent set design and everything, but like, they don't have horses to ride on. Instead, they just click coconuts. They don't, and other things like that. And of course, the effects are cheap, and the film quality is very cheap. And there are a lot of sequences where the writing is I mean, it's just stupid. Like the writers who wrote the script just wrote like whatever dumb shit they could, and again, not in a way that isn't at all clever. There's some very there's a lot of incredible comedic timing in this movie, just all throughout it. But like the situations that are portrayed are just so incredibly stupid. I mean, it's even beyond most parody films in that sense. Like and I think. Another thing that I think is really relevant to mention here too is that I think it's very relevant to mention here too is that like I think scene to scene, like it's just constantly throwing shit at you. Like it plays. I know Monty Python was a sketch comedy show, a sketch comedy group as well, and it very much plays like one. A series of vignettes surrounding the knights in just incredibly silly scenarios that I don't want to start talking about specifically unless you do, and we can put the spoiler tag up just in case anyone hasn't seen this. I don't want to ruin the jokes.
Yeah, I think you can go ahead and throw the spoiler tags
go
up.
For it.
So I would say, you know, after a rewatch, I know all of these jokes. Like, as I mentioned, this thing's it's infinitely quoted. It's just so ingrained in popular culture, and as you mentioned, kind of internet culture too. But even still, just the comedic timing and the way that these things are presented, it still gets me. Like, every time I watch this, I still am laughing at the same things. And there are some, like, for instance, some of my favorite jokes are when they're arguing about whether getting a sword from a lady of the lake is a way of governing a nation. Yeah. Like, there's no basis for a political structure. And it's like these peasants who are arguing with them about what kind of, if they're a monarchy or not.
Help, I'm being repressed. I'm being repressed. Yes.
There's just so many great bits in here. Obviously, there's some that everyone know, like the Black Knight and the Flesh Wound thing, and even that's still funny, like going back and watching that. Just the way that they present these things. And there's still that weird, wacky, like, at this time, British sense of humor, like the very Beatles style of putting animated scenes that really are just kind of nonsense.
Yeah.
Like,
and
they
also
have no
terrible, by the way.
Yeah, just like so bad they don't make any sense. Like but it's just something about it has so much charm and just so much attitude, and they really knew what they were and how to present something like this, because honestly, this, I believe, was their first foray into a feature-length film like this, because as you mentioned beforehand, they were just doing sketch comedy. So kind of working that sketch comedy, those learnings that they got from being able to do that for so long and so successfully, and putting it into a film format like this. I mean, they had many more films too that are also equally hilarious, like Life of Brian and others, but this is kind of where it all started, and it's still just so much fun to go back to.
Yeah, and I also and just to go back on the idea of like this sort of internet sense of humor, there's a very distinct like irony here that I don't know how much you see from this era. I mean, even from parody films of this era, right? Like, for example, there's one of the funniest moments in the film is when they're in the cave, they get chased by a monster, but they they specifically call it they ran out of budget, so they switch it to an animated sequence. They're running for the monster, but the animator has a heart attack and dies, so they couldn't finish the sequence. I mean, it's stuff like that where it's like the film. I mean, yeah, it's fourth wall break, but it's more than that, right? The film is like, part of the joke of this film is specifically that it is a movie, and it's using the fact that it's a movie to its biggest advantage, like calling out specific production aspects of the film. I think of the opening title sequence, which goes on for way too long and like keeps getting fucked with. And things like that, where it's like,
yeah, or when they kill a historian who's just happening to be filming on their film location, yes. and then the actual police are chasing after them.
Yes. So I really appreciate a lot of that. One of the things that I want to say I don't like, and this is a spoiler, this is probably the one thing that I don't like about this movie, or maybe not the only thing. I mean, you know, I'm sure we could both admit there's like probably a joke or two in here that doesn't really work. But like, the one thing that I think I don't like, I really do not like this film's ending. I mean, I guess I can't think of a different way to end it, but I just feel like every single time immensely disappointed when the film just ends with the police showing up and arresting everybody. Like, I get it, but it's not even really done in a funny way. It just kind of like happens and the film ends, and it's like, okay. And I always thought that kind of killed it a little bit. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, but besides that, like everything, the fact that I don't really have bad things to say about everything leading up to that point. I mean, the weakest sequence is probably the one where I don't remember who the knight is, but he enters like that harem of a bunch of women who are just constantly trying to goad him into having sex with them. That's probably the weakest sequence, but it's still funny. It's still got a lot of great jokes. I mean, like. One of the best moments in this film, perhaps my favorite, if I had to pick. And again, I don't remember who the knight is, but when the knight comes in to rescue what he thinks is a princess, he just runs in, and there's just like immense scenes of just like him going through and just slaughtering everybody, like people who aren't even in his way, just killing them all. And like he shows up, and then it turns out the person he was rescuing wasn't a princess, and he still ends up going and killing everybody anyway. That bit is just incredible.
Yeah, and that the recurring joke of people not actually quite being dead yet
Yes.
also rears up there, because they're like, oh, well, he'll marry the princess, and because her father's not alive anymore, I'll get all the land. And the father's like, no, I'm still okay, and they go and kill him.
Yes, amazing.
Yeah, there's just so much good stuff in here. It's just, and it's not that long either. It's an easy watch. It's one of those. It definitely on my list is one of the top comedies, even still, even going back to it. It's been such a long time, but like this and Airplane are such great spoof movies that they're just such fun rides to watch and go back to.
Yeah, and do we think we can wrap it up?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, because what I want to say specifically about the question of does this, wow, I'm having a really hard time taking down the spoiler tag. If I ask the question, does this hold up? I think it holds up in spades, because once again, I think this film was incredibly influential to the kind of comedy that we like now. And pretty pioneering in that regard as well. Not to say that other spoof movies didn't do similar things, but there's something about this one that just feels so like incredibly self-aware in a way that like 70s comedies really don't, and something that like really has led it to help hold up so incredibly well. So yes, it absolutely holds up. A score 9 out of 10, I'll say. I think the movie is just wonderful. It's incredible how many hilarious scenes are in this. It's crazy that it's still this funny to this day. It really doesn't matter how many times you watch it. It's endlessly rewatchable, and of course very quotable as well. And yeah, it's just brilliant. I love it. So yes, I recommend it, obviously.
Yeah, and for me, it goes back to the question for a comedy like this of does it hold up? Really goes back to the question of like, can you watch it again and still laugh at those jokes? And for me, absolutely yes. Like they're just so funny, and the delivery of them is great. There's just a lot of really smart stuff here. It inspired a musical, which is kind of weird to me, but it did. So there was a musical version of this, and that was also really funny. Yeah, I agree. I give this about a 9. There are some scenes here that I think go a little too long, especially some of that animation stuff, like very British sensibilities when I see some of that, and it goes on just a little, it just keeps going, basically. So some of that stuff I didn't enjoy, but for the most part, as you look at this holistically, it's just so much fun and so funny. So I definitely recommend it.
Score.
Definitely recommend going back.
Score?
Yeah, I gave it a 9 as well.
Nice. Okay, great. Okay, let's move on to recommendations. So I'm going to give the first recommendation. So here's something that we're doing for the big 30, the big 30, because again, every episode is a big event, but especially if it has a 0 at the end of it. We are doing a brief series of episodes. It'll be 3 Get Recc'd episodes called Re-Rec. And what Re-Rec is we're going to go back and recommend specific things that are continuations of previous recommendations, whether that be an album by the same artist, a film by the same director, a film in the same franchise, more episodes of a TV show, anything like that. That's what Re-Rec is. So, Steven, my Re-Rec to you is I am recommending you the Swans album, To Be Kind. To Be Kind was their 2014 album. It's 2 hours long, so give yourself time to digest it. And that is all that I will say. And what do you got for me?
So, Louis, I'm going to recommend to you the Ariana Grande album, Thank You Next. This is her most recent album, actually came out earlier this year. Kind of surprisingly, she had an album that released last summer. No one really expected her to release another album within a couple of months, but there it is.
Fantastic. So when we come back, everybody, we will begin Re-Rec I appreciate everybody for sticking with us
Yeah,
and strapping in for this rapid fire episode, keeping it under 30 minutes here. We got about a minute left to kill, but that's so thanks everybody.
This next one will be fun because I have some thoughts on Swan's albums and Ariana Grande albums, so I'm sure your fans are really going to enjoy what I say about these two.
Yes, absolutely. So we'll come back. We'll have a great discussion and expect 2 more Rerecc'd episodes after that. So thanks everybody for watching, and I think we're done.
All right, those were our thoughts. Those were our recommendations. Get wrecked.